Anybody ever heard the phrase, life's not fair? I take that as a yes. As I thought about that the last couple of weeks, we've all heard it. We've probably all said it. Or if you're not willing to admit that you've ever said it, you at least thought it. Because we all face situations that we think, man, life is just not fair. We've all felt it, we've all said it, we've all thought it. Probably we've all struggled with it. I know I've struggled with it at times. And there are numerous situations that we face in life that cause us to say or to think life isn't fair. Maybe a loved one was taken away from us very suddenly and very unexpectedly, maybe even after a long sense of illness. But we've looked at that situation and thought, man, that's just not fair. Maybe a young child or a young adult struggles for their lives. And maybe through an accident or maybe through illness, a loved one or a young child is struggling for their lives. And we look at that situation and we think in our minds, man, that's just not fair. This is a young child. They haven't even lived yet. And yet they're struggling to live, and maybe their prognosis is not good. Maybe a tragedy of some sort hits and lives are lost. Maybe something as simple as, I work long, hard days. I put in a lot of hours. And I struggle to make ends meet. And I know other people that don't seem to do anything. And they have all that they want. And they have all that they seem to desire. And their life seems to be good. And everything seems to be going great for them. And I struggle from day to day to day. Maybe we look at a situation like that and we think, man, life is not fair. And maybe it's something unrelated to anything that I've said so far. But there are certainly difficult circumstances that we all deal with in our lives. And at times we look at our circumstances and our situation, or maybe that of others, and we think, man, that's just not fair. Life is not fair. I remember, as a kid, not my brothers did this. Hope they don't listen to this tape. Mom and Dad would tell them something and they would say, oh, that's not fair. Now, I never did that. Probably I did. But, my parents taught us at a young age that life's not fair. Get used to it. Live with it. And that may sound good, but it really doesn't help us when we're struggling with that question, does it? If I'm struggling with a situation and somebody says, well, life's not fair, live with it. That's not very comforting. It's not very encouraging, to say the least. As I've thought about, that statement, life is not fair, and I mentioned this a little bit last week. It's kind of a side note to our message this morning, but something that I've struggled with over the years in thinking about answering that question, life is not fair, is this. Who determines what's fair and what isn't? I've struggled with that many times. If I'm crying out and saying, man, life's not fair, well, who determines that? What is fair and what isn't fair? And it's interesting to me that if something happens to me that's good, well, that's fair because I deserve it. If something bad happens to me, well, that's not fair. I don't deserve that. And so you can see how subjective some of those things are. Life is not fair. Well, our couple this morning, Amram and Jochebed, that I mentioned already, are introduced to us in Exodus chapter 2. And as I said, their names aren't mentioned until Exodus chapter 6. But they're introduced to us, and the story that we really know them for is introduced to us in Exodus chapter 2. And as I read that passage again this week, I thought, in verses 1 and 2, really should have been a very happy, joyful time for Amram and Jochebed. Look at what it says. Now, there was a man in the house of Levi, and he took him a wife who was a Levite woman. And the woman conceived, and she gave birth to a son. And she saw that her son was a fine or a beautiful child. Now, this should have been a really happy, joyful time in their lives. Amram and Jochebed, this Exodus 2 almost makes it sound like they just got married and Moses is their first child. And we know from the other chapters in Exodus that that's not the case. They had been married for some time when this took place. They had 2 other children when this took place. They had already had Aaron, and they'd already given birth to Miriam. And so they already had 2 children. And now Jochebed is pregnant again, and they're getting ready to give birth to their 3rd child. And for most families, actually for almost all families, that is an extremely joyful time. It's a time to be happy. It's a time to celebrate. It's a time that even if there's difficulties, brings families together and at least for a time seems to make them close again. And yet, we see that it really wasn't necessarily a happy time for them. At the end of chapter 2, we're kind of given a glimpse to that. It says, she hid the child 3 months. Well, that's a clue that something's wrong. Because when somebody gives birth to a child, what's the first thing that they do? They announce it. They show it. This is 2014. They put it on Facebook. And I did that when Parker was born a couple of weeks ago, and the whole world knew that quick. And you couldn't wait to put that, adorable little baby online so that the whole world could see it and say congratulations and enjoy it. I mean, that's what we do. And even before Facebook, people started getting on the phone and they would call and they would, as quick as they could, get pictures and hand pictures out and send announcements because we want the whole world to know that we have a new life. And yet Amram and Jochebed gave birth to little baby Moses, and they hid him. Something was going on. Now, if we go back to Exodus chapter 1, we see what the situation is. It says in verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Well, you know Joseph from the book of Genesis. Joseph was the man who was hated by his brothers. And Joseph was the man that was sold as a slave in Egypt. And to make a whole long story short, because you know it, Joseph became second in command in all of Egypt. And a drought hit. And as a result of Joseph's position, his family, really the Jewish people, were brought to Egypt and they were cared for and they were saved alive. Well, that was years earlier. And now in verse 8 it says that a new king arose in Egypt that did not know Joseph. Well, it doesn't mean that they didn't know Joseph. They knew their history. They knew who Joseph was. They know his position. They knew why he was there. They knew what he had done and how that was used. But they didn't know Joseph in the sense that they felt obligated to treat his family special. They didn't feel they owed Joseph's family anything. Who are these people? They're Jews. They're outcasts. They're not Egyptians. They're not part of us. And so the new king, the Pharaoh, decided that these people, Joseph's family, were a threat. And because they're growing in number and they're getting stronger, if a nation ever comes against us, and Joseph's family, the Jewish people, decide to rise up against us, the Egyptians, we're in trouble. And so we need to do something about it. And we don't have a lot of time this morning, but the Pharaoh decided that he was going to oppress them. He was going to oppress them. He was going to, in some way, destroy them. And so in verses 10 to 16, that's what he did. He afflicted them with heavy burdens. And yet, instead of making them weaker, it made them stronger. And so he made them servants. He made them slaves. And instead of weakening them, it strengthened them. And so then he said to the Egyptian midwives who were helping the Jewish women give birth, he says, here, here's what I want you to do. When you're helping these Jewish women give birth, if they give birth to a boy, kill him. Kill the baby boy. And let the girls live. Well, we read in Exodus 1 that the Egyptian women were in fear. They feared God, and they feared the Jewish women. And so they said to the Pharaoh, well, these Jewish women are stronger than we are. They're giving birth before we get there. And we don't really have the opportunity to kill these babies because they're already born and they're already, being taken care of. And so the Pharaoh makes a new law in verse 22. The king ordered that all newborn babies be thrown into the Nile River and drowned. He said, well, if the midwives aren't doing it, then I'm going to make it a law. And any Jewish woman that gives birth to a baby, if it's a girl, great, baby can live. But if it's a boy, that baby needs to be taken down to the Nile River and thrown into the river. and drown. That way, in the Pharaoh's mind, the Jewish people will get weaker. They won't have any males. And their females will marry an Egyptian man, and therefore they'll become Egyptian. And so that is the situation that Jochebed and Amram are giving birth to the baby Moses in. I was reading another pastor had spoke on this passage, and he wrote this in his notes, and I thought it probably fairly well described the situation of the day. It's about a paragraph, and I want to read it to you. This pastor says, "Can you hear the grieving, the shrill crying of mothers, and the heavy sobs of fathers, as their newborn sons are discovered and torn from their clutching hands? Imagine the sound of the tossed babies hitting the water, the noise of a last splash to live, and the ensuing dreadful silence. Feel the unimaginable heartache of moms and dads every time they came near to the Nile River, the watery graveyard of their sons. Unimaginable pain and turmoil. And think of the anxiety of pregnancy, a wondering fear of whether the baby would be a girl and get to live, or a boy facing certain death. The pain of labor giving way to the irrepressible joy, only to turn to overwhelming anguish that a river of death awaited." I thought, wow, what a situation. You can only imagine the joy of life and the fear and the anxiety that the nation of Israel faced. Every time someone became pregnant and expected a new baby. As I thought about that, I thought, I've honestly never faced a situation that was as unfair as that one. I've never faced a situation in life that was as unfair as that situation. What do we normally do when we face an unfair situation? How do we respond? What's the natural way to respond? A couple of thoughts came to mind. First thing that we do is grumble and complain. Can't believe it's not fair. We put it on Facebook. You won't believe the situation that I'm struggling with. How unfair. I don't know what to do. It's not right. And something needs to change. A second thing that we do is we play the part of a victim. We play the part of a victim. We take on the victim mentality. Woe is me. Woe is me in my situation. Why do I have to struggle with this? Why do I have to deal with this? Why couldn't it be somebody else? We take on a victim mentality. A third thing that people often do is, and I don't know how else to say this, we play possum. We roll over and play dead. In other words, we do absolutely nothing. Why try? I've tried all my life, and this is what I'm stuck with. This is what I have to struggle with. Why do I even bother? Why do I even try? Well, as we look at Amram and Jochebed giving birth to a baby boy in the middle of a situation that may have been considered one of the most unfair situations in all of history. I can think of a couple others that would rival it, but one of the most unfair situations in history. They dealt with the situation in a way that I think is a challenge to us and a lesson to us. Because they didn't take the victim mentality. We don't see, at least in the text here, that they grumbled and complained. And we don't see that they sat back and did nothing. They did something. They acted. And I think that we can learn about dealing with our unfair situations as we look at what Amram and Jochebed did. The first thing they did, we see in verse 2. It says that she conceived, she bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine, or some of your translations say, beautiful child, she hid him for 3 months. The first thing that she did is she saw that Moses, the baby, was a beautiful child. Now, Annette and I had the opportunity in the last couple of weeks to get our hands on a new little baby. And what do you do when you pick up a new little baby for the first time?
Hug
families are all doing it. We look at this little baby, and she's all, in our case, she is all curled up and wrapped in a blanket, and you can see their head. And you look at it and you go, oh, what a beautiful little child. And I don't know what you do, I know what I do, I think most people do, you count their fingers and their toes. And I don't know, I like to rub my hands are cold this morning, rub the little baby's head, and you rub their cheeks and their face, and you think, man, what a beautiful baby this is. And you just, you enjoy that, and you adore that, and you think, man, life is an amazing thing. And all of us look at especially babies that are born into our families, and we think, man, they're the most beautiful baby that I've ever seen in my life. We all think that. And I have no doubt that when Jochebed and Amram looked at little baby Moses, that they did the same thing. People haven't changed. We're the same. They thought that there was a beautiful baby boy. But I think here, when it says that they saw that he was a beautiful child, I think it goes a lot deeper than that. It goes much deeper than that. And we read in Acts chapter 7, kind of a summary of this, but in Acts chapter 7 it says, but as the time of the promise drew near, which God had granted to Abraham, the Jewish people, increased and multiplied in Egypt, until there arose over Egypt another king who did not know Joseph. Sounds like chapter 1 of Exodus. He dealt shrewdly with our race and forced our fathers to expose their infants, so that they would not be kept alive. And then verse 20 says, at this time Moses was born, and he was beautiful in God's sight. When Amram and Jochebed looked at baby Moses and they saw that he was a beautiful baby, I believe that what that means is they saw that he was in some way a baby that God was going to use to change their unfair situation. I believe that they looked at that baby and somehow, in their heart of hearts, they said, this is a baby, this is a boy, or eventually a man, that God is going to use to work in our situation. Now, I don't believe that they knew how God would do that. I don't believe that they knew when God would do that. I don't believe they knew any of the details. But I believe that when they saw baby Moses, they said, this is somehow a person that God is going to use. When you and I look at our unfair situations, those things that we struggle with, I believe that the first thing that we have to do is know and believe that God can work. Jochebed and Amram looked at baby Moses and they said, God can do something. God will do a work in our situation. God will deliver. God will work somehow. And they saw that in Moses. And when you and I face unfair situations, the first thing that we have to do is believe that God can do something. We have to believe that God can do something, that God can work. And as we believe that, or even as we think that, it's going to go against everything that we see. What we see is babies being thrown into the river and drowned. It's going to go against what we hear. We hear the crying parents that are grieving the loss of their sons. It's going to go against what we can understand. How can God ever turn this around? It's going to go against every one of those things. But we have to, as Christians, believe that God can work. And we have to believe that God will work. If we fail to see that God can work, and if we fail to believe that God will work, we'll take on a victim mentality. We'll slink down and sit down and cross our arms and stick our lower lip out and we'll pout. And we'll say it's not fair. And nothing will change. Nothing will happen. And Amram and Jochebed believed some way that God would work. Again, I don't believe they understood what God would do or how or when. But somehow in the face of baby Moses, they believed that God would do something. And we need to believe that as we face situations in our own lives. Notice what else happened in verses 2 and 3. it says at the end of verse 2, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes. And she dabbed it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it, and placed him among the reeds by the riverbank. The second thing that I believe that she did is that she did what she could. She did what she could. And she trusted God to do the rest. She did what she could, and she trusted God to do the rest. Sometimes when we face unfair situations, we don't do anything. Because everything that it seems like we could do, seems like a little bit. Well, I can't do that. What's that going to change? How's that going to help? It's just a little thing. It's just a little bit. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to change my situation. Now, Jochebed, I would have to assume, must have felt like hiding Moses in her house for 3 months seemed like very little. 3 months isn't going to save his life. 3 months isn't going to change the law. 3 months seemingly isn't going to accomplish anything. But it's all she could do. What else could she do? Nothing. So she hid the baby for 3 months and likely put herself and her entire family at risk. But that's all that she could do. And again, when we face situations that seem unfair, we need to do what we can do, however big or little it may seem. And then what happened when that little bit wasn't enough anymore? What happened then? She took a basket. She put pitch in it so that it would float. She put the baby Moses in it, probably wrapped him up in cloth or clothes, and took him out and put him in the bulrushes, put him in the reeds by the river. What else could she do? She didn't have any other choice. What else could be done? She did what she could. And she trusted God to do the rest. I said last week, we have to be careful that we don't get the impression, well, that was easy. Yeah, she put him out in the river and she knew that. No, we're looking back at the story. We're looking back. If we put ourselves in Jochebed's shoes, this is probably the hardest thing she'd ever done in her life. And she probably thought, what is this going to help? How is this going to do anything? I don't have any choice. What else can I do? She did what she could. And then when she couldn't do any more, she did all that she could and she trusted God to do the rest. She acted in faith and she believed somehow God is going to work in this. I don't know how, but somehow God's going to do something. Notice in verse 4, and his sister, who would be Miriam, stood at a distance to know what would be done. I don't want to leave this out. And I thought about it and I missed it the first time I put my notes together. But to me it's significant. She waited to see how God would work. And I believe that she dreamed about what God might do. She dreamed about what God might do. What else could she do? She put this little boy in the river. Now, what did she expect to happen? I don't have any idea. I don't know what she expected. She didn't know what to expect. Worst case scenario. Pharaoh, soldiers, going to find this baby boy and throw him in the river. Watch him drown. Best case scenario. I don't know what that even is. But she dreamt. I can only imagine how God might use this. And all I can do now is sit back and wait for God to work. I can't do anything else. And so she dreamt in her mind, okay, maybe this will happen, and maybe that'll happen, and maybe somehow God will spare my little baby. I don't know, but she dreamt and imagined what God could do. And you know, I think sometimes we need to sit back and dream and imagine, what can God do in my situation? You know, you and I face situations that seem unfair. What can God do in that situation? Now, I'm not going to say that God's going to do what you're dreaming of. That would be lying, and I won't tell you that. But I will tell you that to believe that God can work is to dream about how God might work, and to dream about what God might do. our time is gone already this morning. But the next thing that she did here, real quickly, is she saw God work in an amazing way. I think this was bigger than she ever dreamt. I don't even know she dreamt God would do this. She left this baby in the basket in the river. And the Pharaoh's daughter just happened to come to the river at the right time. This baby just happened to cry at the right time. The Pharaoh's daughter just happened to have compassion. The Pharaoh just happened to allow her to keep this baby. And just happened to allow Jochebed to be hired to care for her own baby. And Moses just happened to be raised the son of the Pharaoh's daughter. Could she have dreamt that? I doubt it. I have to believe this is more than she could even imagine. But she saw God work. She's looking to see what is God going to do. And she saw God do amazing things. Do you know why I believe at least that most of us fail to see God working in our lives when we face an unfair situation? I believe that most of us never see God work in our unfair situations because we're not looking for it. All we're focusing on is how unfair it is. We're not focusing on how great God is. You see, the whole series that we're talking about is our insignificance, but God's significance, God's greatness. And if we fail to recognize how great God is, we'll never see God working in our unfair situations. You know the rest of the story. God raised up Moses. And Moses eventually, 80 years later, he lived as a son of the Pharaoh for 40 years. He followed sheep for 40 years. And then God spoke to him in a burning bush and said, go back to Egypt and deliver my people. And Moses went back. And God turned a long-standing, unfair situation into something that God's people still look back on and say, wow, God is a great God. And God used insignificant people like Miriam, or like Jochebed and Amram to bring that about. Now, as we close this morning, what unfair situation is thrown in your way? What unfair situation are you struggling with in your life? And it probably varies for all of us. I challenge you this morning as you think about your situation. I challenge you to dare to see and believe that God can work in your situation. I'm not asking you to tell me how God's going to work or what God's going to do. I don't know that. But I challenge you to dare to believe that God can work. And dare to believe that God will work. God can work in your situation no matter how great or how unlikely it seems. I challenge you to not only believe that God can work, but I challenge you to do what you can. I don't care how big or how small your part is. Do what you can do. Do the only thing that you can do. And then trust God to do the rest. As you do what you can do, dream about how God can work. What can God do? God can do more than you can think or dream. Dream. Be excited about what God might do. Look for ways that God is working. Look for ways. How's God going to work in my situation? I'm going to look. I'm going to see what God's doing. I don't want to see how big my situation is. I want to see how big my God is. And imagine how God might work. Look for God to work. And then praise God when you see His hand in your situation. Praise God when you see Him working. Look at what He's doing. Trust Him to do the rest. I realize it always sounds easier when I preach it than it is to live it. I realize that. But you know what? Jochebed and Amram are a great example of how to deal with an unfair situation. And they're a great illustration for us to see how big our God really is. Well, let's bow for prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you this morning for your word. Thank you for these seemingly insignificant people. They have really one story tied to their name all the way through the Bible. And yet, Lord, you are a great God, and you use them in a tremendous way. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be able to apply some of these things in our lives. Help us to see you. Help us to realize, even in our unfair situations, how big a God you really are. We thank you in Christ's name.